Okay, fantastic. So I am really excited to be with you today. I'm disappointed that I'm not there in person, and I have to tell you that the huge auditorium I see is the size of a postage stamp on my screen. So I'm really hoping, despite that, that we can engage in a conversation both with the people in the physical audience, and I know that we also have a virtual audience, virtual like myself. So Tony, thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I will make sure to let my mother know that she remains the coolest person, you know. But I have to say that you neglected to say that we are collaborators and co-teachers, and I have learned so much from working with you, and I just have tremendous gratitude for all that you have brought to my work around participatory action research. So can you all now see my screen? And is that the main thing you see?
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. So I am going to be talking today about the theory, the epistemology, some of the dilemmas and the methods and case studies around participatory action research. I'm going to try to not take up too much time because I really do want to have that discussion. And I have to tell you that I just want to say the audio in the room is not great. So we'll have to figure out how I'll actually be able to hear people's questions and comments, but we'll get to that. So getting started. Okay, so here are the four kind of agenda items that I want to explore with you guys today. And so the purpose and epistemology of PAR, the idea of research from the margins, what is that? And why are we interested in it? Then I want to talk about the practice of PAR and the PAR practitioner and the role of the PAR practitioner in action research. And then finally, some case studies that we have done of work we have done at CoLab. Well, first, purpose and epistemology. And if I'm going too fast, if you can't hear me, somebody just yell. So I'll know to stop and adjust, please. So here is a working definition of the participatory action research that I really like. So PAR is a disciplined inquiry, and it is about a specific and consequential social justice challenge that the community itself identifies. And there can be a lot of debate about who is the community and how do we know as academic researchers that we have connected with a legitimate representation of the community. But for now, we're just going with this definition that PAR is grounded, it is disciplined, it is not simply a set of stories. It is an actual research method of which stories can certainly be part. And it is connected to consequential social justice challenges. It's critically important, and I would say it's never been as important as it is now, because in this complex, technologically advanced world, being able to know what you need to know now is an essential component of democratic citizenship. And John Dewey, Paulo Freire, and Arjen Appadurai all talk about this. And Appadurai calls it the right to research. Dewey calls it citizen science. And Freire calls it liberatory education. Yep. So there's been an age-old debate about where knowledge itself comes from. And sort of this is the essence of epistemology, right? So Plato said that it comes just from the mind, that abstract ideas and thoughts are the true source of knowledge. And Aristotle said, no, actually, it's experience. So Plato here is, this isn't the greatest resolution, but Plato here is pointing up to the sky. It is abstract, it is in the mind. And Aristotle sitting on the steps is pointing down. No, it's grounded, it's in our own experience. It's there that we derive our knowledge. And so from a PAR standpoint, we say that the source of knowledge really comes from a dynamic communicative interchange. So the social world is not just an objective reality to be measured, and that's sort of the traditional natural sciences approach. It's positivism, that you can, whatever it is, our job is to observe and measure it as scientists. We in PAR say that the social world is a system of institutions, practices, and narratives that are co-created by humans. And it is through communication that we build understanding. And that is called hermeneutics. It's just another approach to understanding knowledge. And we also say that the task of the PAR researcher is to continuously kind of toggle back and forth, measuring theories against actual reality. And that is philosophically called pragmatism. Here's the thing with the PAR researcher and with social science in general, that the study of society is fundamentally different from the study of natural sciences in one particular way, or in one way particularly. And that is that humans have the ability to observe and reflect on their world and then change their behavior accordingly. So just given that idea, which is double reflexivity, that you can both reflect and then reflect on your reflection to change your behavior, you become both the meaning giver, meaning I can decide what this means, even as I am studying it and being studied. And so that's a really important kind of transformative concept, because a lot of social science traditionally will hold that people are no different, people who are being studied are no different from colonies of bacteria, and that you can kind of measure and predict their behavior based on some set of rules and findings that you make. And in PAR, we say, no, the difference is that humans can see what we are doing and change our behavior. So here are the, so now that we're into the sort of PAR epistemology, here are the basic foundations of PAR knowledge creation, that it is context bound and it is dealing with real life problems, that it is a co-creative process that at its essence is about collaborative communicative process, and all contributions are taken seriously. They're in a PAR project, you only have co-researchers. You don't have researchers and subjects. And everyone has a role to play in the research project. Diversity of experience and capacities is critical for having the richest possible results. And interpreting the results is not just to gain more knowledge in the abstract, but actually to lead to social action. And at the end of the day, whether or not the knowledge that is created is credible and valid has to do with workability. So being actually able to solve problems with the knowledge that you've created and to increase the participants' agency in their own situations. So I'm actually going to stop for a minute because I want to have a sense of whether you all have any questions or any unclarities, and we can come back to the slide, but I just want to get a sense of whether this is landing, whether you have any questions before I proceed.
Any questions? We've used a lot of nouns that you may not normally know. Any questions? They apply to both of them. All good? Okay, Dayna, if we can go ahead.
Okay, I'm having a little trouble hearing, but I think you're saying keep going.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this chart summarizes the differences between traditional social science research and participatory action research along three key indicia of quality research: reliability, validity and credibility, and generalizability. I'm not going to read all of the boxes, you can see them for yourselves, but the thing I really want to hone in on, two things. One is that, again, a huge standard of reliability and quality in the research is whether it actually works to solve a consequential problem. And the other really important thing to know about sort of research credibility and quality is generalizability. And you know this from your own work, is obviously a really important standard of research quality. But in the context of PAR, generalizability has to do with whether you can reflect on the lessons learned in this particular context, and then compare similarities and differences across place based on your deep knowledge of the context in one place to see what can be adapted and applied in another place. Research from the margins. So what is this idea of research from the margins? So, sorry. So the first thing, so the idea of research from the margins is, in traditional academic settings, people in marginalized communities are the objects of study, not the participants and the knowledge co-creators. And their own lived experience and observations about their experience is not consequential for the work of the academic researcher. And for those of us who do PAR work, we say that actually tracks a tradition of colonial research, that the purpose of research on humans and on social contexts traditionally, in part, particularly in poor communities, was to reinscribe forms of oppression and dehumanization. And so I'm building on the work and citing the work of Linda Tuiwai Smith, who says actually that research from the Western gaze is a dilemma for the researcher looking for a more liberatory approach. And from the researcher's standpoint, living within that gaze that discards, marginalizes, disregards the perspectives and experience of the people who are being studied. So having to be within the framework of Western epistemology while seeking to assert a different kind of humanity and a different set of understandings about the world, that this is a key challenge for people doing this kind of work. The second challenge is seeking to make sense of the world that has been cast within this framework while seeking to transform it and into something that is more just. And the third challenge, so it's all kind of working within this Western framework of research, struggling to define what is human based on the experience of not being considered fully human. And at the same time, not essentializing the identity and the meanings ascribed to the experiences of people at the margins. So these are some of the challenges of doing this work. How do you step outside of the dominant mind frame and seek to transform it, even as you're seeking to understand experience? And Frary says, on the other hand, this is the liberatory possibility of working in a more participatory context. That humans, men and women, are humans in the process of becoming, and that we are aware of our incompletion, and that our quest for knowledge is part of our process of completion. And it's not just that we as humans are struggling to complete ourselves, but also that reality itself is not static. And thus, we have the capacity to change it if we can get our arms around and understand our contexts. And the third thing is that actually the process of getting our arms around and seeking to change our contexts itself is a process of knowledge creation, and it is the most reliable form of knowledge creation, that we are constantly seeking to invent and reinvent our circumstances to improve our lives. That is the source of our knowledge creation. I'm giving you all of these I'm giving you these alternative ways of thinking about knowledge to say that an important part of participatory action research is to fight for epistemological diversity, that there are many ways of knowing our contexts and seeking to struggle to change them. Not just sort of the positivist approaches that will have you only witnessing and measuring. But in a world view where everything has life and the ability to speak if you will only listen, and everything has the power to teach and guide, then you will, as the researcher, have the task of developing methods and seeking approaches that will help you learn all that is around you. And just using a ruler and a microscope and the traditional kind of, I'm using those as metaphors, but traditional sort of social science measures will not give you the possibility of learning from all of the life that is around you. And so it is important to fight for epistemological diversity. I'm going to stop again, see if there are any questions or any comments, any thoughts before I move on to the practice and the practitioner. Keep going, okay. So I've given you a lot of sort of abstract ideas about what participatory action research is, but so what are the methods for that? And how does one position themselves to be a responsible and effective PAR practitioner. So that this is this next section. I've said this before, but let me be more specific in saying that in a PAR model, research is co-created. There are no researchers and research subjects. There are only co-researchers. And all of the decisions about the research are collaborative, whether to undertake it, what the questions are, selecting the methods for pursuing the questions, interpreting and owning the data and the findings, and determining the program of action. And so again, remember that the purpose of this kind of research is to solve a consequential problem of social justice. So it's not enough to know that knowledge must be applicable and workable towards a solution to this consequential problem. Central to the idea that PAR is a problem-solving methodology is not just that it is seeking to address the single problem that is in front of it, in front of the research team, but that actually the process of doing the research builds the capacity of the inquiring community to make decisions. And that requires, as part of the PAR process, that researchers create discursive arenas, spaces where the entire research team, all of the co-researchers, can reflect on, understand, develop hypotheses about, and think about ways to apply the knowledge that is being developed. And so the first criterion, again, is building capacity to make decisions, basically to solve the next problem that arises, but also that the co-researchers are using reflective practice, looking within themselves, stepping back and paying attention to their own positionality and actions in the research process, to build awareness about how their actions and activities are impacting the process. So capacity building and reflection are two core activities of PAR research. Just want to make sure, okay. This is a really important set of, maybe we'll call them requests. So Maria Torre and Michelle Fine, in trying to address kind of the ethical power positionality challenges that arise when academic and community co-researchers are collaborating on a project, they talk about nosotras, this idea, with a hyphen, us and others. And they talk about working the hyphen. So understanding throughout the research process that there is a very dynamic relationship amongst the co-researchers that itself requires interrogation and investigation as much as the topic of research. And, I'm sure all of you have heard ideas around this idea, like allyship and intersectionality, and trying to understand what is the role of the individual in the team with respect to the social dynamics of injustice. And so this, I have found over and over again, this set of sort of requests and exhortations to be really helpful in kind of keeping us all honest in doing this kind of research. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. I'm not going to read them, but I'm going to describe them a little bit. So the first idea is that our identities are only meaningful in relationship to each other. What does it mean to be a person of color? It doesn't have social meaning without reference to a larger dominant society that is not of color. So this is a relational context, and the first thought is that we co-create each other's identities and are accountable to each other for treating each other with respect and empathy and regard. But we constantly have to interrogate what are the ways in which we are co-creating each other's identities. The second idea is that it is the practice of traditional social science to set the researcher up as the kind of the God voice, omnipotent, objective voice in the research, studying the other. And in talking about the other, there is an immediate sort of marginalization and social distancing, and I don't mean in the sense of protecting health, but in the sense of protecting power and positionality. And so this idea that social science research fingers the other, it is you who is responsible for social dysfunction, while powdering the nose of the researcher, because I am setting my own beliefs and values and identity as the norm that does not need interrogation, but I'm going to interrogate your behavior. Why is it that Black kids in the hood are so violent? Why is it that girls become teen mothers? What is it about the family that produces poverty? And these kinds of othering questions that don't look at larger social dynamics and don't look at the ways that middle-class families or elite families create dysfunction and violence and social ills that within the context of traditional research are not considered dysfunctional. And so this approach is to say, let's build resistance to that kind of othering. And here are some practices that can do that. I love this idea of uppity voices that interrupt master narratives. So many years ago, a social epidemiologist did a study about teen pregnancy, and she found that the majority of young women who were having children young were 18, not 15, and that she looked around the world at women facing threats to their reproductive health and learned that around the world, women facing the kind of reproductive threats that women in the place she studied, I want to say it was Detroit, were facing, had children at around the age of 18, because if they wanted to have families, by the time they were 25, their reproductive prospects significantly narrowed. So this is a very different story from the story of those girls just have loose morals. And so this idea of an uppity voice that says, maybe we want to look at the context and consider women's choices as reasonable choices given the context, rather than to sit in moral judgment, fingering the others while powdering our own noises. Hear subjugated voices as primary informants. So what this epidemiologist got to this because she interviewed a ton of young women who had children. And she learned about the risks they were facing. And then she was able to look in a more global way at women similarly positioned. Dissecting elites' constructions. studying what actually is happening when this narrative about violence, Black and brown boys' tendency towards violence. Like, what is the technology being used to construct that violent, criminalized identity, and exposing it for what it is, and speaking critically to it to highlight that it is an othering, not a description of reality. You can see the rest of these for yourself, but I just want to say cite one other one. Bartering privilege for justice. This is a very dicey one. And so this idea is, if you are in the academy, and if you are in a position to bring resources and authority to a conversation, how do you deploy that positionality to advance justice in particular ways? And I want to give you a real life example. There was some work that Fine and Torrey did in the Bronx, where they were trying to call attention in a particular neighborhood to extreme police misconduct and harassment. And they did a whole bunch of survey research, meaning the kids in the neighborhood with the academics did a bunch of survey research and really got a profile of what was happening in relationship to the police and the community. And then they did a public presentation on the street. They used chalk and drew statistics on the sidewalk. And they had these big projectors, and they were projecting out some of the findings of their study. And in the middle of this presentation, the police come and surround the presentation. And the white men, academic researchers who had come dressed for the occasion wearing suits, stood in front of the kids, the Black and brown kids, who the cops were trying to get at. And it's a really extreme example of bartering privilege for justice. And it's a small example, but this idea that the cops are not going to immediately whip out the baton when they see the white guy in the suit. They're going to ask him what he's doing there. Whereas they're quite likely to whip out the baton and go after the kid in the hoodie who's been collecting the data. So bartering privilege for justice. And then using this set of relationships that are built over time between co-researchers to get the deepest and richest possible data. And that only comes from trust and discourse and shared sense-making, and thinking about the ways that that can really improve the findings, the quality of the findings. And then finally, expand our minds and constrict our mouths. Enough said. So in doing this work, we have developed some tools to help us mind all of the requests and exhortations and values that I've just been describing. And so we call it a personal theory of practice, and it is has the potential for a lifelong practice that helps us inquire into our understanding of our own positionality, our own aspirations, our own foibles, our values, our identity that we bring to our professional work. And at the end of the slide deck, I've got a site that can, if anybody is interested in looking at this kind of work, that can that has some resources. But the idea is this is the thing about reflective practice, that as you begin to do this kind of work and you come up on these contradictions, that you have a way and a space and a methodology for processing your own understanding of the contradictions and how you respond to them, so as to consistently over time articulate your own values and align your practice and your work with those values. So that's the personal theory of practice. Okay, I'm going to stop again and see if there are any, there's something in the chat, which if somebody can tell me what's in the, I'll just look at it. Is it still hard for you? Can you guys still hear me okay? Okay. All right. So I've got some case studies, but I wanted, that was just such a huge download of information. And I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions or any observations, any personal stories about work they have done that has implicated some of these ideas.
I guess if you wouldn't mind, could you please elaborate on the idea of no surplus and what do you clarify that by
If can some, oh my goodness, John Forrester.
Dayna, can you hear me from here?
I can.
Okay, this is our working mic. I think this mic, the handheld does not work very well. So Liam had a question asking if you could elaborate on the idea of nos otras a little bit more and what that means.
Sure, and I also see John, just in terms of the virtual world, John has a question. So maybe I'll take both questions and then I can respond to both.
Great.
John?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can. It is such an honor to have you talk.
Likewise, I was with you all the way through the first half of the talk. And then when you got to practices, I was thrown. Because when you got to practices, you said the practices, should we do the research or not? Define the question, define the methods, interpret the data, so on. That's the traditional scientific way. And I would have thought at practices, you'd say there are things like listening to people's stories, sharing meals, building trust, doing projects, doing things together to show that you're there and being alongside people. There's this whole vast set of practices that seem to connect people in a par context. And maybe we'll see in the Brooklyn, the Bronx, and the Buenaventura, not only individual solo reflection, but not only the I of solo reflection, but the we of working together. So I'll leave it there.
And so I just want to tell you, John, that absolutely, that the examples, I'm talking about abstractions and I'm about to get to specific examples and how we did that work in these places.
Great, yep.
So I will definitely get to that. And thank you for that. Nosotras, the idea, the core idea here is that we are both, that any research collective, any human collective process is one of us and others. And the work to be done is in better understanding the relationships between us and others, whoever the us is and whoever the other is. And so it is in the work of interrogating, how am I in understanding and articulating my own identity, creating conceptions and ideas and influencing my interpretation of contexts in relationship to the other one. And when we are constantly seeing ourselves, not just as encountering static identities and static contexts, but actually complicit in creating the understandings of the other person, meaning the interpretation of who they are in these contexts and what their roles are. Then we begin to take responsibility differently for how the work unfolds in a context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, thank you so much.
I don't know if you heard that, but he said he's good.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay. So I want to give you, I wanted to give you first set up the context here for the case studies. This is the work that I did at MIT before I went to Tufts. And we were a planning and development lab and our premise was that when communities are facing disruptive moments of change, people at the margins are at greater risk for being more marginalized. But there's also an opportunity to change the existing arrangements and to make them more just. And so what can help, in our case, we were a planning lab, so what can help is bringing the planning discipline to support the aspirations and ideas and demands of the community among the most at-risk, marginalized people. And in that work that we did, we were working with colleagues who were highly sophisticated, who were movement builders, who were looking for radical change. And our task was to bring the technical expertise to substantiate their aspirations and claims. So in each of the cases I'm about to describe, there was a disruptive moment. And we were asked by our colleagues in the community to support their struggle. So I don't have them in the order I just listed them. In the Bronx, we were approached by a community coalition that was facing a proposal by then Mayor Bloomberg to turn the second largest armory in the world into a major shopping center with retail jobs, minimum wage retail jobs. And the organized community said, absolutely not. We already have the third largest retail district in the state of New York, in the Fordham Road area. We don't need more minimum wage retail jobs. We want a plan that can create community wealth. And so they came to us with this idea. In this case, they actually sent one of the organizers to planning school to write his master's thesis on this dilemma. And he convinced us at CoLab that we should partner with them on this project. And so he studied cooperative development in Mondragon, Spain, and then proposed not a shopping center, but an ecosystem of small business creation, co-op creation. And our task was with the community members to do a study of all of the potential sources of wealth. And so we did a participatory capital survey, and we looked at all the different forms of capital in the community. And that was a project that was developed jointly with it was the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition that worked with us to design the study, to supervise our students, to process the data developed by the students and the organizers together. And then to build a set of short medium, and long-term proposals, given the particular assets in the Bronx that had promised for wealth creation and connected to growth areas of the economy in the region. And so this is a picture. We did a bunch of exercises with organizers and MIT students around understanding how the economy works, how wealth is created, and given the promising areas of economic activity in the Bronx, and it was healthcare and food, and there were 5 areas: healthcare, food. I don't remember what all of them were. But that, what did the community want to see? And we put together a master development plan for the Bronx. And then with the organizers, created an organization whose sole role was to hold the planning process for the long term. And that organization still exists. It's called the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. And it has taken on everything from convening the local anchor institutions, the hospitals, the Fordham University, the Bronx Zoo, the Bronx Botanical Garden, to co-investigate how these anchor institutions can support economic growth in the community and not just exist behind high walls. And then they've also, BCDI has taken on more immediate things, like it became clear over the course of the last, at this point, 8 years, that one of the biggest sources of diminishing wealth in the Bronx was gentrification. So then BCDI, which at this point was mainly organizers, but some students, then came back and said, we need to do a study around alternatives to gentrification. And out of that came a whole effort around community land trusts. So beginning with this disruptive moment of our livelihoods are at risk because of this ill-considered development proposal, to an ongoing capacity that seeks to address, kind of to advance the development aspirations of the community. That is the story in the Bronx. I'm going to stop there and ask questions, and ask John if that begins to get at some of the methodologies, some of the approaches that we use there for you.
Dayna, let me say real quick. I mean, what jumps out at me is you said lots of exercises together.
Yeah.
Right? And on the way you're creating the BCDI, you're building this organization. I think it's not so much sequential, but the questions are emerging and new ideas are emerging as relationships are being built through those exercises, through other activities together. So yeah, so the answer is yes.
And thank you for that elaboration, John. You've been doing this work a lot longer than I have, and I'm so excited to hear your reflections on this piece.
Works both ways. Thank you.
So I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about Brooklyn next, because I think it it actually literally did build a little bit on the Bronx. So because CoLab had relationships in Brooklyn, folks in Brooklyn were aware of what we were seeking to do in the Bronx. And I would actually argue that they learned from what we did in the Bronx and took it several steps further. So in Brooklyn, and the other thing I want you to hear in these different case studies is each of them is very context specific. So even though you're learning something from the last place you may have heard about, you are responding to something very particular in the place you are. So in Brooklyn, the governor announces that he's going to close a safety net hospital. And this was a horrible hospital. I mean, this place, patients and staff were actually murdered in this hospital. It was a really, talk about, not saving lives. But it was also the only safety net hospital for miles and miles around. And folks wanted the jobs to be saved. They wanted access. It had strong mental health and addiction services. It was the only emergency room for maternity services for miles around. So the hospital had to be saved and revived. And so we were approached by the labor union 1199 and a coalition of community leaders. And they said, we know you're doing something around wealth creation. We know you're doing something around community research in the Bronx. You got to help us figure this out. And so we, first we did bring in a group of like MIT researchers to work with, I'm saying faculty, and to work with students and leaders to deeply investigate the health circumstances, the social determinants of health in the service area of the hospital. And we actually organized over the course of 6 summers, high school and college students from the community to do street surveys, focus groups, and kind of deep inquiry into the particular circumstances of each of the discrete neighborhoods within the service area of the hospital. And they helped to reveal the specific obstacles to better health in the community and the needs in the community. And we put that together in a report that kind of laid out the actual health circumstances, the sort of the health data, the levels of hypertension, the levels of diabetes, et cetera, but also proposed that underlying all of this is poverty. The biggest determinant of poor health is poverty. And so if you want to, they were closing the hospital to save money. If you want to save money, you've got to figure out how to improve the economic circumstances of the community. And so we proposed together, the community leaders and the collab team proposed what came to be called kind of like a health empowerment zone. And it was a comprehensive look at all the ways in which city and state agencies could use their functioning and their resources and how all the hospitals in the region, in the area. So there was a whole other piece of this, which was the state was going through a healthcare reform process. And so they were looking at the functions of the hospitals. And so we said, use this moment, this disruptive moment, to transform the healthcare delivery system by embedding wealth creation mechanisms into the community as you are building this thing. And this, I mean, the students began making public presentations around the community. This became such a powerful, and I should say, it was very focused on the target of keeping the hospital open. The hospital brought in a bankruptcy administrator from Cleveland or something, who they were charging who was charging $500,000 a month to administer the hospital. And the community asked for a meeting with her and asked her, how are you going to save healthcare costs and improve the health profile of this community? And she said, gentrification is coming. I'm going to sit you all out and wait until a healthier community exists here. And the community said, no, we are going to run you out. Don't you ever step foot in this hospital again. And we're going to make our own way. And they did that. They occupied the hospital and they ran this person out and the administrator who had hired her. And they brought in the first Black woman administrator ever of a public hospital. And they chose her because she expressed a clear commitment to this idea that the hospital is a driver, an economic driver in the community. And she has become one of the greatest proponents of using all of the hospital processes, procurement, hiring, physical plant maintenance and development, to support wealth creation in the community. This process also, it was an election year, and this is really, really important because it's not just the brilliance of the ideas, it was the politics in the moment. All these electeds lined up to support the union, to support the community, and the governor ended up pledging $1 billion, more than $1 billion, for healthy housing, for affordable housing, healthy food access, green space development. And the community, CoLab came into this thinking, we are a development lab, and we do participatory development. And the community leaders came back to us and said, no, actually, we think what you do is you are helping us build civic infrastructure. You are helping us create all of these spaces for deliberation, for discourse, for decision-making about our future. And within that, we are creating knowledge that we need to make our proposals credible and actionable in this struggle for a policy decision. The students, it became such a norm. At this point, we've trained maybe about 300 students, and it became such a norm to deeply investigate a question. Every time another issue came up, when they broke ground for the housing, for one of the affordable housing developments, the community said, we need a PAR project to figure out what actually the housing needs in this space are. And, for us, after a while, it's like, we actually cannot support another PAR project. We just don't have the resources. And so, but the community, the students said, we have constituted ourselves as a community of inquiry. And that became the watchword across the whole effort in Brooklyn. We are a community of inquiry. We are learning how to shape our own development. And I just want to say one other thing about this civic infrastructure. And I actually, I can put it in the chat when I stop talking in a minute, but we actually did a popular education case study that really described this process in Brooklyn. But so many different elements of the community became activated that a local theater company, while the community was occupying the hospital, started performing a play every night in the hospital. And it was an Edward Albee play that was about a poor Black woman in the South who dies on the way to the hospital because the hospital is too far away. And every night they are performing this play as, and the community is there watching this play. And so it's all these different spaces for consideration of the stakes and for conversation about what needs to change and building of a consciousness, of a movement consciousness. They did a funeral parade across the Brooklyn Bridge to City Hall with like, this is where our healthcare is going. They carried an empty coffin across the Brooklyn Bridge. The hospital, I said this implicitly, but the hospital did not close. They got somebody in there who was committed to building the community. And she is such an extraordinary administrator. During this healthcare reorganization process at the state level, they gave her 2 more safety net hospitals. So she had now a conglomeration of hospitals that she has committed to being part of building the local economy and seeing the economy seeing the hospitals as a driver of the economy. So I'm giving you the highlights. This was not a fully linear process. It was fraught all along. There was so much contention. There were so many points of failure. But underneath it all was this capacity that the community was building for itself, that we were supporting. It was agency. It was its ability to know, to respond to a consequential challenge with a thoughtful, credible set of proposals based on knowledge creation that the community did with an academic institution, leveraging the academic institution, but driving the process towards the results that they were looking for. So I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions about that.
Dayna, are you at the end of your presentation, or is it another breaking point?
I could talk for a second about Buenaventura, or I could stop. Whatever is your pleasure. We have until 2?
I'm until 2:20, but there's plenty of questions. So I would
Great.
think we should have you conclude, and then we'll just open it for.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So let me just talk about Buenaventura for half a second. So Buenaventura is in Colombia. It is in the Afro region of Colombia. It is a 97% Afro region. And here the question was it is the largest deep water port in the nation of Colombia, and racism and systemic disinvestment has left it as a city, despite the high-tech, world-class container facility. You go 5 blocks, people don't have reliable electricity or water. There isn't a reliable hospital. The gang violence is so extreme within blocks of this world-class facility are human chop shops, where if you run crossways against the gang, you are going to be found in bits in the mangrove swamps. And the government, for reasons I cannot explain, did an equity study that highlighted the poverty in the region, and then said they were building this port, expanding the port rather, facility to address the poverty in the region, in the city. And so community activists got a hold of the design for the redevelopment, and it completely circumvented all of the poor communities. So the community said, wait, do you really think we are that dumb? And used the report to build a strike movement that completely closed the city down. And talking about sort of civic infrastructure, in this case, the civic infrastructure was literally the street. So every day, the strike committee set up tables and circles and spaces for people to argue and discuss what were the key sectors of development that they wanted to see coming out of this disruptive moment, where the city was tearing up, the national government was tearing up the streets and reorganizing the infrastructure. And that strike committee continued to meet, and they shut down the whole port, and they got a bunch of concessions. In this case, they got $500 million US pledged to equitable development. I will tell you, this is not a success story. We were brought in to help them develop an equity report that actually, unlike the fake equity report, that really did make proposals about how they could do the development differently and how they could address some of the community needs. And the strike was violent and people died. and when I say the strike was violent, I mean the state attacked the strikers. People died, but they continued to meet. And for years, they continued to meet afterwards and continued to put forward proposals and to sort of cultivate a political base. They decided they needed a new mayor of the city. And they held nominating forums on the street. This is what we need. Tell us what you think about this. No, you are not the guy for us. And the strike committee and the people came up with their own candidate and then mobilized on the street to get this candidate elected. And he won. But there has not been substantial development there. The candidate who won is a protest candidate who does not have the capacities and the resources, the planning resources to actually build something different. And so he's got the political will, but he doesn't have the technical resources or the financial resources to build the alternative. And so CoLab continues to work in that area. We have shifted, I'm saying we, it's not we anymore, but I still say we. We have started doing kind of smaller micro things like aligning. We've done a lot of work in the rural areas around Buenaventura, bringing in Afro heritage agricultural concerns, you know, not companies is not the word, but like growers, to bring their produce into the city directly and to have sources of revenue in the face of COVID. You know, so we've been doing sort of smaller scale efforts to align the development aspirations in the region with some kind of economic activity. But it is to say that this is not all happy work. And at the end of the day, I think what persists and what gives hope is this capacity building, why it is so critical to the project of action research for social justice, is that I believe what we have co-built is the infrastructure to continuously respond to problems and ameliorate crises. But we have not yet, in this place, made a major breakthrough in development. So on that complicated note, I'm going to stop and really I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. And I'm going to take down my screen so I can try to see people. Hold on. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly inspiring set of experiences that you brought together, both the theory and the practice, to give us a sense of how we can carry forward the work. And I'm really taken with how so many of us do research on social justice, but the action of social justice as part of the method of the study and the practice is often not there. And some of us are on a search right now. We are doing a search on social justice and planning a position. And it really is illuminating, I would say, as to the kind of work that we're actually looking for that can be this kind of inspiring. So our students often have plenty of questions. Since this is the mic that is with, I invite you to come down and then speak in front of our guests here. Let me open with a question, and I invite the folks online to add their questions as well. I'm still organizing my thoughts, but I'm going to just be the first person out here to buy people a little more time to gather their thoughts. I think I would like to ask a question about scale. And I know that when Elizabeth Young-Pierre gave her keynote at ACSP this past year, she's very critical of this question of scale, because people always ask about scale and say like community-based work, community mobilization, EJ, and environmental justice work. And I think I would extend to here PAR is always perceived as being very local, very context specific, very community scale. And so much of research either is at that larger quantitative scale where you can do national or international studies and come up with a hypothesis and a conclusion, or that seeks to be generalizable in a way that it can then be transferred across a large geography. And so for Elizabeth Young here, her work was saying, the question isn't the scale of we are small scale, the question is why there are not more replications of what we do to create the movement for change, because we hit above our weight, we hit above our the monetary figures that we get, and then we're able to take local-based movements to transform New York State politics, to transform national politics through the work that we do. And I'm wondering how you see PAR. Do you see a role for PAR in that kind of multi-scalar sense?
Yeah.
Or is PAR necessarily context specific to the power building of the individuals in a more localized space?
I love that question. And I think it's a very complicated question. So I think scale, for me, scale is all about movement building in politics. You cannot achieve scale unless you move into, I believe, policy and government and large institutions that have the resources to move agendas. It doesn't mean that the work isn't consequential if you don't achieve scale. So I hear what Elizabeth Jean-Pierre is saying, but I think it's from CoLab's perspective, and I would say now from Tufts, I think at some level you have to be very conscious about movement building, because that's what it takes to change things. So I said before in the beginning of my talk that workability and generalizability are, in my view, in the PAR context, are, you're looking at the nuanced lessons and understandings that you've developed in one context so that you can be very clear and specific about what applies in another context. And you're doing that with local partners who have deep knowledge of the local context in a way that you never would as the academic coming in. So we did the Bronx work. It was mainly in the context of retail development initially. And when we moved to Brooklyn, what was translatable was this idea that you could build an ecosystem of cooperative businesses. But many of the details were not translatable. It's a very different political configuration in Brooklyn, very different community players in Brooklyn, very different relationships across the players. And in fact, Brooklyn, in my view, was more successful, but it began with this idea that was translated, that the community could, using its own kind of political sensibilities and political mobilization, begin to shape its own economy. And the particular mechanism was co-ops or community ownership. But in Brooklyn, it targeted a set of anchor institutions. It transformed the anchor institutions and then used that to begin to develop a different kind of economic presence. In the Bronx, we struggled really, really hard to move the anchor institutions. So it's very context specific. In Buenaventura, again, the idea is community kind of social action to shape markets. But there, it took the form of both opposing a massive, sort of the design of a massive infrastructure project at one scale, at one level of scale, and then coordinating local artisanal producers and bringing them into the center of the city at another scale. So, you know, you have to understand the particularities of where you're working. And, you know, you can't just transplant concepts from one context to another, but getting richly insightful about how social action can transform communities and what the holding spaces are and how to think about the different economic sectors. Those are the things that can translate. And all of it, you know, we chose to work with 1199 because 1199 has scale. It has hundreds of thousands of members and hundreds of millions of dollars in pension funds and direct access to the governor's office. And so for us, our impact calculation really was based on that, not on how smart our ideas for local wealth creation were. And I worry sometimes that academics aren't positioned to get their hands dirty with that kind of engagement. And it's, I mean, it was years of trust building and collaborative work, and it's still tenuous.
Hi.
Hi.
I only know how to frame this question, I guess, in a personal sense.
Sure.
Okay. So coming from what I would perhaps want to describe as a marginalized community, both in the United States and also in Ecuador, South America. I guess that's I studied architecture in my undergraduate degree. I did participatory planning processes during my studies and a bit afterwards within social movements in Ecuador. And there's definitely like an interest there, but then at the same time, there's a general reality of just a very like weak labor markets, few opportunities. And there's a pressure and an expectation to find a stable job, a well-paying job, a job that won't exploit you within this informal world. So I feel like there's a lot of privilege in being able to do the work that you do and to be able to do participatory planning processes or any sort of radical work like that. So my question is like, what other spaces can this be done in? At what, I guess it also goes a little bit to the matter of scale. Like how true is this that like, maybe you can't do this work without like, I don't know how to balance like this pressure and at the same time wanting to do this sort of work. Yeah, I think that's what I can ask.
You know, so actually, I really, tell me your name.
Nina.
Mina. I really like that question, Mina, because, and there's a great article that you should look at, and I don't remember the author's name, but it's called FAQ, and it's frequently, and then in parens, unasked questions about community research. And it really goes into how much of, you know, for the individual scholar, the importance of paying attention to their own personal, to who they are as people in getting into this work, because you can't be effective if you are denying who you are, right? And so it's questions like, are you an introvert or an extrovert? If you're an introvert, don't plan a life of standing in front of audiences. It may not work out so well, and there are other things you can do. If you're the person, if you really want to do community work and you don't know where to get started, pick up a broom at the community center and just start sweeping. And see what emerges when you do the smallest thing being part of a community process. And so you have to attend to your own personhood as a way of, you know, you're the only tool you have. And that's not ego, that's not individualism, it's thoughtful planning for being as effective as possible in this essential work that we all know must be done. And And so it is, so that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, you know, I was at MIT for 13 years. I loved being at MIT, and I fought the whole time I was there for the work to be seen, for it to be legitimated, for MIT to not take more overhead than was, you know, to not take an unseemly amount of overhead for the work we were doing in collaboration with poor people from this massive research institution. And I couldn't believe the shift when I went to Tufts, because Tufts is a school that is committed to public life, not brilliant technical research that by its nature will change the world simply because it's brilliant, but actually preparing people to serve the public good. And I've been there 6 months, and every day I think, what was I thinking that whole time I was at MIT? That what I was thinking was, I want this elite brand to legitimate the work of our colleagues. And what I see now is there are so many other ways to have deep support and collaboration with communities when you come from an institution that is fundamentally committed to public good. So I think what I'm trying to say here is, and a personal theory of practice can be really helpful for this. So I would suggest you go to the CoLab website, colab.mit.edu, to look at this personal theory of practice thing. But I think the key thing is defining your North Star. Who are you in relation to this task of what I say is helping to bend the arc of the universe towards justice? That is a massive multi-generational task, and you have some small role to play in that. So position yourself and just begin by really interrogating what your values are and how you think you can best achieve that, and interrogating that over and over again at each new stage in your life. And you will find a way to make an important contribution. You don't have to define ahead of time. You can do it from an elite institution where you're really well paid. You can do it from a less elite institution, but where you have other kinds of resources. You can do it in close collaboration with communities. You can find other ways if that is not personally who you want to be in the world. You can do it through other kinds of path-breaking research. PAR isn't the only kind of research that changes the world. For me, it's just the one that suits my personality and that I think is really effective. And I think that's just say that out loud. It's a personal choice, and that's not about individualism and ego. It's about being as effective as you can.
Hi, and thank you so much for the wonderful talk and all the inspirational words. I had a practice in law before coming back to school for an urban planning degree. And I read that you were a civil rights attorney at the beginning of your career. So I was wondering if you would be willing to share your own personal theory of practice and how it guided you from law and into your current work.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I was a voting rights lawyer, and I became a voting rights lawyer because I was always interested in voice and participation. I was always trying to figure out how communities at the margins could have a say. And so the most accessible thing to me when I was growing up as a middle-class Black woman whose professional parents put a lot of pressure on me to become a professional was to become a lawyer. And in becoming a lawyer, I found voting rights that spoke to my desire to support democracy. And I did that for about 5-6 years, and then became very disillusioned with the law as a practice personally. Again, this is really about what fed my soul. I just got tired of that particular form of fighting. And one of the things, and I also had a baby, and I was taking my kid on the road and like putting him under the table at depositions. And it wasn't a good look. Just, it was too hard for both of us. And so my husband at one point said to me, you couldn't work harder or get paid less in your current job. So it's all up from here. What do you want to do next? And so I just fell into a job in philanthropy. Somebody was looking for somebody and somebody knew somebody and I knew that somebody. And so I just fell into this job. I didn't even know what I was doing. And in philanthropy, the really interesting thing, there's a lot that I really disliked about philanthropy. And I will say, despite the mythology that surrounds philanthropy, I think it is so essentially undemocratic, even though it is promoted as an essential leg of the stool of democratic infrastructure. It is subsidizing rich people to tell poor people what to do, in essence, but I digress. The thing that was really fascinating about that work was that everybody with any kind of creative idea tries to get into the door to see you and to tell you about their idea. And what I learned from that is that everywhere in the world where I looked, the poorest people were organizing their resources to do something really interesting and path-breaking and transformative. Now, I mean, understand I was at the Rockefeller Foundation. So if you were coming from if you were coming from Buenaventura, you already had a lot of access that a lot of rank and file people in Buenaventura did not have. So I was encountering the elites in all of this. And sometimes the elites were community leaders who had access to elites. But my point is that this idea of what came at CoLab to be called innovation from the margins, were people who were facing the sharpest edges of institutional failure, as is human tendency to do, were trying to reinvent their circumstances and improve them. And that fascinated me. And I worked on that. I worked to find organizations that were explicitly doing that kind of work. And I did it until I ran up against an institutional barrier. Couldn't do it anymore. They weren't interested in it. They didn't think it was that important. And I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing that. So I left. And I went to business school. I went to business school because as a lawyer, I had learned to challenge and critique and kind of take apart and build claims. And I wanted to learn how to invent and build and create things. And actually, management science is the science of taking an idea and turning it into a commodity or a service, and to organize enterprise to scale. So it was, that was great. Going to business school was such a refreshing break for me. I was the only one in my class who came from a not-for-profit background and was going back to it. But I had such a great time in business school, and that landed me at MIT. And I went to Sloan at MIT, and that landed me at CoLab. And so I went there just because I wanted to figure out how to continue that work. And then working with our community partners, that's kind of what emerged. So that's the story.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for asking.
Hi, Professor Cunningham. Thanks so much for being here.
Call me Dayna. Call me Dayna.
Will do. My name's Wyatt.
Right.
Thanks so much for being here. I have a lot of questions and I'll try to just focus on one, maybe two. But, and you've touched on it throughout, but I'd be curious to know, as you've talked about kind of the elite perception of the institutions that you as researchers are coming from, how to manage maybe that perceived power or knowledge imbalance between the elite quote unquote researchers and then community researchers. And if that's, obviously it's work to be done on the part of the academic researcher, but I wonder if there's conversation to be had around the perception from a community researcher's perspective. And then in that engagement, if there's any other forms of compensation, which we've talked about here in terms of community engagement, where compensation might make sense in given situations. I'm curious if that fits into PAR.
So is the first question, you understand the work that academic researchers, kind of the internal work that academic researchers have to do, but you're wondering how we think about the internal work that community members have to do? Is that the first question?
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
I'm open for interpretation.
But I want to make sure I'm answering the question you're trying to ask, so.
Yeah, I wonder, because I've done research not related to planning in my past career, and there's a lot of kind of deference to the expertise that I've experienced. I wonder if that's something that you've experienced at PAR that you need to move past to have a true partnership.
So you dropped off at the end, but I think maybe what you're saying is, well, so let me tell you what I think, what the challenges I have encountered on the community side that I can see. There's a lot I'm sure I don't see. But what I noticed is that, and maybe this isn't, I'll answer it and then you'll tell me if this is what you are trying to get at. It is, when you come to work in a place from an elite institution like Cornell, like MIT, for a lot of people, it is intimidating. And so they think you are the expert and they are waiting for you to decide, waiting for you to opine, waiting for you to interpret. And I think it is so important for community leaders to own their own knowledge and their own expertise. And when you are that Cornell/MIT person in the room, there's hesitancy. So there is internal work, I think, and I mean, you know, from elite institutions, we can help it by saying, I just don't know that. I'm not an expert in that. That's actually your area of expertise. But there's internal work for community members to see themselves as co-equal experts and researchers to challenge you when you get it wrong and to hold you accountable. And especially if they are not paying you. You know, early on, I had one partner who was really good for us. And he said, I don't care if I'm not paying you, I will fire you if you don't get this right. And we were scared to death of this guy, and we did great work because he pushed us so hard. So there's that kind of thing that's internal work that has to happen within communities. That isn't always easy. I will tell you that it's something I reflect, so this question of compensation, we never did justice to that at CoLab. I will just tell you that. We didn't think about paying our co-researchers. Let me say that differently. When we worked with the students, we paid the students in the community. You know, for them, it was an internship. But we didn't think about raising money. I didn't think about, let me not socialize it. I did not really think about what it cost the community members, the community organizations in every situation. So we raised money together, And we supported their raising of money. But not until the end of my time at CoLab did we start thinking about, in any sort of disciplined, systematic way, that every project should have budget lines for our community partners. And that's something I actually regret.
Yeah, thanks for, your first question was spot on, or first answer to my question.
Oh, okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Hi, Dayna. Thank you so much. Like Wyatt said, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience at these different case studies with us. And thanks for answering my earlier question about the SOTRS. That was really helpful to for me to sort of like understand the theoretical framework for use of these things. So I'm curious. So in your descriptions of these case studies, it seems like you've like in all three studies, like you kind of described it like you were working with communities where there was a good amount of solidarity amongst the community, like to get things done, to share this collective vision towards achieving. But I imagine that wasn't always the case. Like
All right, you're absolutely right.
yeah, and like yeah, like part of building like communities are like assemblies of individuals, right? And sometimes individuals don't always agree. So I'm curious, like can you kind of share an experience in these case studies or in other areas of your work where you've had to try to like work through these disagreements and with coworkers and partners, and sort of like how you did that. Like how do you respect individual disagreements and try to build them into more of a communal vision, a shared vision that everybody can agree on?
Yeah. So I ended the presentation of the cases by saying it was not linear. It was not without massive bumps. And in each of these cases, there were extraordinary tensions that were constantly being managed or not. And I will say that you have to build very, very strong personal relationships with people to be trusted to work through conflict. And I'm saying the conflict was both within the community, of which most of us were not residents on the MIT side, and between us, between MIT and the local partners. And so in the Bronx, we had a whole, do I call it a dispute resolution process? We had a whole relationship building process with our partners. And it was kind of almost like marriage counseling. Honestly, I'm not sure it was resolved that effectively, but we spent a lot of time in meetings, them and us, talking about, so the Bronx was the first piece of work we did. We jumped into it with enthusiasm and excitement and commitment on all sides, and didn't really work through in advance what the expectations were. And then 6 years in, there was a lot of disappointment and anger and confusion about roles. And so we, and by this point we had been sharing staff and, you know, deploying CoLab staff over to the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, having them hire our people away. I mean, it was a real deep interrelationship, and still we spent, I don't know, 6 months in a dispute resolution process that had us at the end of it all affirming our love and mutual respect for each other. And I'm not using the word love lightly. Over time, when you work so hard and struggle with people, you build we built loving relationships, and still there was disappointment and anger in this process. And all I can say is we just kept talking about it, meaning, you know, we worked out an MOU and we identified what the expectations were. And then we tried repairing relationships, and we all agreed that underneath these difficulties was a commitment to justice and a love of justice and a love of each other. And that's what we did. In Brooklyn, there were a lot of big institutions at play, and building trust across the institutions was just very tedious. What's the word I want? Like meticulous work. And, you know, it was, the institutions were white majority, and the movement was Black majority. And there was just ongoing, again, it was just ongoing discussion about what was at stake and when mistakes were made, and mistakes were made. And there was no magic bullet in any of these situations. So I think they're still making mistakes, and they're still just relying on trust and commitment to get through the mistakes and to get on to the next mistake, honestly. And to continue to do the work, you know, it's, you know, you resolve it, you build trust through the resolution, and then you stumble. And then you resolve it and you learn something about it and it makes you stronger, and then you stumble. So, you know, there's no romantic magic love affair here. And then in Buenaventura, it turned out that what was evolving, it was everybody in Buenaventura was Black. So there was not so much a racial dimension, but there was a generational dimension. And turned out the strike committee was, over time, it became clear that there was like what, you know, old heads running the strike committee. And there was a new generation coming up that was impatient and frustrated with the leadership of the old heads. And they sort of broke off and built their own thing. And I don't know. I don't know where that stands right now. I know the work continues in a lot of different spaces, and I know that part of how the young people broke off was because the old heads trained them. And so I guess they did a good job because folks got annoyed and broke out on their own to do something else.
All right, thank you so much for answering my question. That was very thorough and very kind of very, like, your message about like working through like these differences is very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dayna, we are nearing the end of our time, so let me just wrap up a little bit here. I am so appreciative of the work that you have been doing and your wisdom, both personal and professional, that you're sharing with us. For the students, this brings us to a close for our semester of examinations of different ways in which planning, research, and practice happens. And so at this point, there will be a 3-page paper that's a reflection that I would like you to do. Some of you may wish to do the exercise that Dayna has suggested around a personal theory of practice and thinking about how the research presentations you've seen this semester informs your own understanding of research moving forward. Or whatever else you do, do not summarize the research presentations you have been hearing, but instead really bring out some point you want to highlight. And for me, something that struck me as I was listening to you is that at the first research presentation that we had, which was Karen Chappell, I had introduced this series and said, there's a Chinese saying, 三人走必有我师, meaning when 3 people are walking, necessarily one of them will be my teacher. And so I said, no matter whether you're interested in their research or not, whenever you're listening to someone, there is something that they can learn. And I think that what you shared today is that rather than expecting that your knowledge and learning comes from the professoriate or other professionals around you, that some of those that you will walk with are actually people in the community who lack many of the privileges that we do here. And that if you choose to, as Dayna has suggested here, you will learn a great deal by learning from them as well. So I thank you so much for bringing our lecture series here to such an inspirational close. Really grateful to have your time and wisdom with us. Please join me in thanking Dayna.
Thank you. It's been really fun talking to you, and I hope at some point I get to see many of you in person.
Sounds good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.